Hello and welcome to Left Ahead, where you matter. It's also where we talk about what else matters, issues, track records, and policy. Today I'll be dissecting this false equivalency that's being perpetuated through the media, pitting Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren as virtual progressive clones of one another. This narrative that's being pushed around wants voters to do two things. First, ignore the obvious fact that they're running against each other rather than one of them endorsing the other's campaign, and two, succumb to identity politics. The second reason is worrisome because the argument sounds completely rational. Under the pretense that there's nothing ideologically distinguishing the progressive man from the progressive woman, why not vote to make the first female president in U.S. history? The reason is that these are false pretenses. There's plenty of evidence to differentiate the two candidates despite similar sounding progressive rhetoric. Let's not judge a book by its cover. Remember, politicians are not your friends. The Democratic candidates are vying to become the most powerful person on the planet in charge of the richest country in the history of the world and the largest military force in the history of the world. They deserve to be thoroughly vetted. We can't be lazy and group people based on their identity, assuming they all think and function the same. Find the individual who will fight hardest for women. Find the individual who will fight hardest for people of color. Find the individual who will fight hardest for the rights of the working class. Find the candidate who's most consistent, most unbought, and most uncompromising in his or her values. I strongly believe that person is Bernie Sanders, not Elizabeth Warren. Here's why. It's my belief that money in politics is the single biggest issue ruining this country. Money can go a long way in influencing a candidate and making them realign their priorities, effectively compromising their integrity and putting a price tag on their value. Money brings certain issues and framings of these issues to the forefront of the discussion while putting other framings and issues on the back burner indefinitely. Accepting big donor money is a silent wink and a nod that you're here to serve the interest of said donor, not your voters. Here's where Elizabeth Warren factors in. She has publicly stated that if she were to become the Democratic candidate in the general election, she's open to receiving all forms of money, including dark money. Just listen to her state this herself.
But I wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier that you don't believe in unilateral disarmament. So does this only apply in the primaries, or will you carry this over to the general election or any other election you'll have going forward?
So this is for primaries. Look, I do not believe in unilateral disarmament. We need to win. We need to win in 2020. And when we hit 2020 and we're in a race against Donald Trump, when we're in a race for control of the Senate and control of the House and in control of the state houses and the governor's mansions, in all of those, the Republicans are going to be bringing a lot of money, a lot of power, a lot of dark money, a lot of super PACs, all to the fight. We play by the same rules. And in that one, I say we got to be all in.
I'm deeply concerned by Warren's answer here. I don't want some flip-flopper in chief who changes her values once the competition's out of the way. We were told to vote for the lesser of two evils in 2016, and putting another corporate hack compromised by money who would cozy up to the interests of her big donors is a recipe to repeat the outcome of 2016. Merely adopting progressive rhetoric isn't enough to win me over. We've already been through this. Obama promised hope and change. Donald Trump promised to drain the swamp. Don't take politicians at their word. Follow their money. In my last video, I detailed the alarming need for Medicare for all. This country desperately needs a single-payer system that would provide universal coverage to 100% of the population. Whereas Bernie Sanders
wrote the damn bill.
Elizabeth Warren has been rather flippy-floppy. At a town hall back in March, she advocated for different pathways to achieve universal coverage. If you look at these options that she brings up, they're not even Medicare for all anymore. I mean, lowering the age down to 60, 55, 50? Come on, that's weak as fuck. What about everyone else? Everybody under 30 gets covered by Medicare? Again, that's so weak. What about everybody else? Employer buy-in, employee buy-in, expanding Medicaid? All these options are garbage half measures. They're expansions to the Affordable Care Act. This is not Medicare for all, and Elizabeth Warren knows this. She's just trying to have it both ways. They would perpetuate the greedy profit motives of the private healthcare industry. They would perpetuate the status quo where 45,000 people die annually from lack of healthcare coverage. This doesn't cut it. Medicare for all is the most hot-button issue of the Democratic primary, and frankly, this answer from Elizabeth Warren shows she doesn't take it anywhere near seriously enough. Bernie's bill already exists on the Senate floor. She could come out in full unwavering support of it, but instead she's trying to have it both ways and compromise before she's even taken office. She'll get obliterated by Republicans if she takes this non-committal attitude to the White House. Now, even when she does name drop Medicare for all, she lies about what it entails to try to please everyone. Her rhetoric mimics Obama's optimistic, if you like your doctor, you could keep your doctor. Medicare for All is fundamentally a single-payer system. It's funded through taxes. That's just how it works. Working class families see a slight hike in their taxes. Rich families see a larger hike in their taxes. For the overwhelming majority of families, they're saving money because this tax hike is offset by the elimination of premiums, deductibles, and all copays. It's that simple, and when pressed on it, Bernie Sanders explains it that simply. But Elizabeth Warren, again, wants it both ways.
Could you do what you want to do with all your plans and not have a tax on the middle class?
Sure.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, look, I've got a housing bill that'll build 1.2 million new housing units, fully paid for.
No tax on the middle class for any of them.
Corporate investment, a green, nope.
Either she's lying that middle class families won't see a hike in their taxes, or she's lying that what she's proposing is actually Medicare for all. The 30 million people that are uninsured in America can't afford to gamble on which is which. Elizabeth Warren has been heralded for bringing the fight to financial vultures, boasting a strong record of being tough on banks. Supporters like to point to her proposal and establishment of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, as evidence that she's on our side and more than willing to fight the good fight against greedy banks, credit card companies, debt collectors, and payday lenders. Here's the thing. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau really hasn't changed shit. What does Warren's CFPB do? It publishes complaints against financial institutions so customers can hypothetically make a smarter choice in the future. As we all know, shaming corporations makes them completely change their practices. If only we had a Consumer Telecom Protection Bureau to finally warn everyone just how bad Comcast is. They would have no choice but to demonopolize themselves out of pure shame. The CFPB is a worthless organization which looks at financial institutions on an individual basis, as if it's a few bad apples that are spoiling the bunch. It does nothing to recognize their problems as systemic. It does nothing to change the legality of their collective greed. Now, Bernie Sanders' foreign policy isn't the gold standard by any mean, but Elizabeth Warren still pales in comparison. Let's put the two head to head here. Regarding Venezuela, Warren has stated, "I support economic sanctions." Now, economic sanctions on Venezuela only make a starving and struggling country starve and struggle worse. Bernie, on the other hand, co-sponsored the Prohibiting Unauthorized Military Action in Venezuela resolution of 2019 back in March. To Warren's credit, she followed suit and co-sponsored the bill a few months later. It's a commendable move on her part. Good looks, Warren. Another country where Warren is on the right side of history is Yemen. Saudi Arabia is leading a coalition that's currently staging an armed intervention in the Republic of Yemen. This intervention is responsible for human catastrophe. There's almost 6,000 deaths to date, more than 2,500 of which are civilian casualties. To make matters worse, the US has chosen to side with the Saudi-led coalition. Elizabeth Warren has co-sponsored Senate Joint Resolution 7 to direct the removal of US armed forces from hostilities in the Republic of Yemen that have not been authorized by Congress. As for Sanders, he introduced the bill. So once again, Bernie's ahead of the curve and leading the charge with his policy proposals, but this co-sponsorship is nonetheless a great move by Warren. No faults here whatsoever. With North Korea, we can observe a much faultier stance from Warren. Kim Jong-un is an authoritative dictator. His reputation is as a loose cannon who's armed with nukes. It's imperative that we rock the baby to sleep, so to speak. Butter him up, comment on his impeccable golf swing, whatever stunt you need to pull, just to keep his finger off the fucking red button. Because when you're dealing with male egos as fragile as Kim Jong-un, as fragile as Donald Trump, the number one priority is global peace and global safety. When Trump met with Kim Jong-un to do precisely this, Warren remarked, "I'm very worried that Donald Trump will go into these negotiations and Kim Jong-un will simply take advantage of him." That's a bad take, yo. Orange man bad. Yes, obviously. But for Christ's sake, can we just stop playing sports teams for 1 second and focus on the bigger issue here? I don't know what scenario Warren was even hypothesizing and in what regard that Kim Jong-un would be taking advantage of Trump, but whatever the case may be, this hysteria is so unproductive and so much less important than the primary goal of maintaining global peace. Talking about the same meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, Bernie remarked that it's a positive step in de-escalating tensions between our countries, addressing the threat of North Korea's nuclear weapons, and moving toward a more peaceful future. Bullseye. Now, mainstream media pundits love to paint this conflict between Israel and Palestine as complex. It's an easy escape route from actually dealing with the reality and the statistics, which show that Israel is suffocating Palestinian territory and overwhelmingly killing Palestinians in lopsided fashion. A snapshot of this reality came in 2014's war in Gaza, where between July 8th and August 27th, 2,104 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip. According to the UN, 1,462 were civilians, of which 495 were children and 253 were women. Meanwhile, 66 Israeli soldiers and 7 Israeli civilians were killed. This isn't an even conflict by any means. This is dehumanizing genocidal tactics on Israel's behalf. In response to the war in Gaza, Warren stated when Hamas puts its rocket launchers next to hospitals, next to schools, they're using their civilian population to protect their military assets, and I believe Israel has a right at that point to defend itself. Yikes. Bernie, on the other hand, stated, was Israel's response disproportionate? I think it was. Elizabeth Warren was a Republican until the age of 47. In 1996, under Bill Clinton's administration, she was in her 20s when Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford were in office, in her 30s when Ronald Reagan was in office, and in her 40s when George H.W. Bush was in office. Far past her formative years, it's concerning that she maintained a party alliance with these advocates of trickle-down economics, an escalation of the war on drugs, tax cuts to the wealthiest, etc. Now, I'm a strong believer that people can change and grow out of their old ways. I mean, I've held some shitty views that I've since learned from, and so I wouldn't give this topic much weight, if any, if Elizabeth Warren just said something along those lines, but she hasn't. Instead, she's offered a contradictory explanation, claiming that at the time she was a Republican, she was completely apolitical.
What were your views back in the day? Because if I read correctly, you were a Republican up until the mid-'90s, I think until 96?
Like nah. I just wasn't politically active. I
So
didn't grow up.
you weren't a Republican?
No, I was registered.
Okay.
But I wasn't politically active. I've always been in the policy end of what we need to be doing. I got into the policy end of it in the fight around families who go broke.
So what made you register as Republican back then? Because that's the Reagan years, that's the war on drugs.
Like I said, I just wasn't politically active, one way or the other.
Was your
that's
family
when
Republican? Is that why? Like sometimes you do it, your family
when
registers?
I say we weren't active, I actually don't even know.
Okay.
I don't even know how
You
they
had
were
a lot of
registered.
confusion back in the day, Miss Warren. You thought you was Native American. You thought you was Republican. Like when did you get on the right track? You got to a fork in the road at some point.
Yeah. You know, a big part of it was when I got into the fights over, you got to make the law reflect our values. You got to have a law that doesn't just work for those at the top, but that works for everyone else.
I'm not buying the idea that a person in her 40s who held an inherently political job as a Harvard law professor could somehow be completely removed from the political world. Even CNN is woke to this dishonesty. Long before Elizabeth Warren became one of the nation's leading progressive voices, she was an academic who articulated a conservative worldview on the economy. As a law professor in the 1980s and 1990s, Warren criticized the overabundance of government regulations, calling them a tax, and spoke to conservative legal groups like the Federalist Society and the Manhattan Institute, a CNN K-File review of Warren's academic research, interviews, and speeches in this period found. Doesn't sound so apolitical to me. Elizabeth Warren talks a good talk about, and I'm ready to fight those darn corporations. I'm gonna bring it tough. I'm gonna be tough. We're gonna bring everyone to the table and show them that we're ready to fight. Her track record shows decades of proof that she's much weaker than her rhetoric. She's a regular flip-flopper, a deceitful compromiser, a perpetuator of this neoliberal ideology that simply wagging your finger at the power structures of society can make them change their ways and start to work for everyone. Capitalism is an inherently evil system which prioritizes profits over people, which rewards the most apathetic and selfish among us, and which forces us to see each other as competition rather than comrades working towards a common good. Warren, a capitalist to her bones, believes in this wretched system, while Bernie Sanders wants to fundamentally reshape the system so that it works for all Americans, not just the top 1%. He proposes most comprehensive criminal justice plan out of any candidate, which would reduce the gorging prison population by 50%, Medicare for all, which would save the 45,000 people who die annually from being unable to afford medical treatment, the Green New Deal, which would combat the end of the human race, housing for all, which would end homelessness, eliminating all. I trust Bernie Sanders to fight for me in my future because he's been doing so for the extent of his adult life, not just when it became politically convenient. In the 2020 Democratic primary, and hopefully in the 2020 general election, I will be voting for Bernie Sanders, and I hope you will too. My sources and Patreon are down in the description. Thank you for watching.